From the Temple in Independence, Missouri, welcome back to CIMM Sessions, our little bite-sized servings of theology, culture, and community of Christ, identity, mission, message, and beliefs and practices. I'm David Lloyd, the director for the Center for Innovation in Ministry and Mission, or CIMM, as most know it, through the Graceland and Community of Christ Seminary. Welcome back, folks. This is a great opportunity we have for 8 classes that will be spread throughout this year. And the first 2 this session are going to be our part 1 and 2. We'll have 3 and 4 later, and 5 and 6 later, and 7 and 8 somewhere in January. So they're going to be spread out through the time, but we hope you can attend all 8 sessions. We're going to be talking about Community of Christ theology and how that pertains to our experience as participants in this faith movement, where we've come from, how do we believe what we believe, and how do we explain that? How do we process through that? I'm sure a lot of this is going to be rehashing for some people. For others, it's going to be new. But for all of us, it'll be a learning experience as we talk about how we process through our own theology as a faith movement. And joining us again are Tony and Charmaine Chvala-Smith, who come to us from the seminary and from Graceland and from the life in the church that they have blessed us so much with over the past. And we welcome you and thank you for joining us again.
Thank you, David.
We're really glad to be here. So, 8 sessions where we're going to be talking about the development of Community of Christ theology. It's something we're asked about all the time. Many people say, how did we get to where we are? People who are members of the church saying, this is so different than what I grew up with. But people outside of our tradition as well who are saying, considering where you started, how did you get to where you are now theologically? So this is a question that we've got a chance to answer lots of different ways and different times. So this is the first of 8 weeks in a series. Now, we've done classes on Community of Christ theology in our undergrad at Graceland, in the seminary, and on weekend retreats. We're going to approach this one just a little bit different because we have a different amount of time to do this. So we'll explain as we go. So we're going to begin with kind of a basic, what is a theology? And this will be helpful as we go into this whole process of thinking about what is the Community of Christ developing theology. Theology, it is the beliefs, thoughts, practices, actions, and teachings that shape the life of a community. And in this series, we want to understand how our theology developed from about the 1920s to the present. Our methodology will rely on both history and theological interpretation.
1820s to the present.
What did I say?
1920s. Back when I was in high school.
High school. Oh, that's why there's 2 of us. Keep each other on track. 1820s to the present. So we're going to be using both history and theological interpretation. So the discipline of history strives for objectivity, but pure objective history is always a goal, and it's really never an achievement. While we will be trying to understand and explain the church's past theology in its own context, in its history, in the history that came out of. Another of our tasks in this series is to help us all have a better idea of how our theology has developed into what it is today.
So we always like to start Community of Christ theology classes with this little picture in front of you. How did we make the quantum leap from 1831 to 1996? 1831, section 1 of the Doctrine and Covenants, excerpting from it to lay the foundation of this church and to bring it forth out of obscurity and out of darkness, the only true and living church upon the face of the whole earth. We fast forward to 1996, and we read these words: claim your unique and sacred place within the circle of those who call upon the name of Jesus Christ. Be faithful to the spirit of the restoration mindful that it is a spirit of adventure, openness, and searching. So that's a very interesting storyline. That's the trajectory of our theology in two texts, really.
Mhm.
And I think it's really interesting to note that in 1996, we actually canonized a text that, in essence, said, we need to make a course correction on what was said in 1931. Notice in 1996, it doesn't say, we're the only true and living church. We really could not say that anymore with any kind of authenticity or legitimacy. So in these sessions, what we're going to be doing is a kind of balancing act. Now, a complete history of all Community of Christ theological developments from 1820 to the present is not something we're going to do. That can't be explored in brief formats like this. There's too much to cover. But what we're going to do in each session is highlight a few historical moments and then explore their theological implications. And, our human tendency is to look at the past and interpret it through our present understandings or experience. That's not wrong, but it's problematic. We shortchange ourselves and the people of the past if we haven't taken seriously their realities and their contexts. Amazingly, by the way, it's often the case that from our present experience and understanding, we're able to see things in the past that our ancestors weren't able to see. That's kind of the nature of historical study. We can only do history from the present, and we have our own lenses from the present to look back. But sometimes those lenses obscure, and sometimes they give us clarity that our ancestors didn't have about certain things. So we're going to employ, wherever we can, kind of careful historical inquiry, after which we can practice then responsible interpretation for today. And that will necessarily at times include critique or criticism of some aspects of the past and embracing other aspects. From the present, sometimes I can look back on my earlier life and say, I don't know why I did that, but I see it now as a really dumb thing to have done, right? And so it's the same in church history.
Just one thing?
That was plural, my dear.
Okay, good.
So in church history, it's the same thing. We can look from the present with the experience and lenses we now have and say, I sure wish they hadn't have done that. So that's going to happen a few times in these sessions together.
And that means that we will lift up some aspects of our story and we'll look at them from different angles and say, where were they hindrances or where were they helps? And so there will be some opportunity to critique. And that's part of why we have titled this Called to Question, the story of Community of Christ theology. Because questioning is something we actually do pretty well, and we'll see that all the way along the journey. So an example of this kind of critique is something that Tony and I have talked about, discussed, been aware of in a variety of settings. And the question might go something like, well, what about the Trinity? So if we look at the earliest parts of our church's tradition, the Trinity was really very important at the beginning of the movement. And that can be seen in the sacraments. Baptism, communion, confirmation, they all presuppose a Trinitarian view of God. However, Joseph's theological experimentation along the way that included things like concepts of multiple gods, hit the beginning with his Book of Abraham and Kirtland. This all conflicted with and kind of undermined those basic Christian ideas about the Trinity. So Joseph's ideas, strongly influenced by, I would say, literal and uninformed reading of the Old Testament, deeply compromised the early movement's ability to maintain clear language around the nature of God, or to stay grounded in its Trinitarian roots that were there at the very beginning. And so the Trinity got lost in the chaos. And this lack of clear and consistent theological language about the identity of God really handicapped some of the groups that formed after Joseph's death, including the reorganization where Community of Christ comes from. Part of the theological journey of Community of Christ in the last 60 years is to kind of remedy that, to be more intentional about articulating, reclaiming, and deepening that language. So that's an example of the kind of critique that we're talking about.
All right, so we're going to move on, and we're going to highlight 7 different features from the early period, from the period roughly 1820 to 1844. It's really important to understand that Community of Christ only has those 24 years in common with the Mormons. Right? It's a small percentage, really. But it's the formative period, and in some ways I like to call it the experimental period. And so one of the things that we want to pick up first is Joseph's first vision, which occurred somewhere around 1820. And one of the interesting things about this is most church members who know anything about the first vision know the latest account of it from 1842, but they tend not to know the earliest account, which was handwritten by Joseph in 1831, 1832. It's a manuscript found in the Kirtland Letter Book. And that letter book covers the period from 1829 to 1835. And so you can read the full extent of this experience either in volume 1 of Mark Shearer's 3-volume history. He has it in an appendix, I believe. Or you can find Dick Howard's old article from 1981 about the six versions. See, this is very interesting. Joseph's first vision, he wrote it 6 different times in 6 different ways. But here's from the earliest one. We think this is really important, and it's very important to focus on the early one. And in the earliest one, what sends this teenage boy out into the wilderness is a deep sense of his own sinfulness, right? He experiences a sense of his own estrangement from God. He sees what he believes is hypocrisy in the Christians around him. And he says, I'm going to quote a short bit from it. He says, I cried unto the Lord for mercy, for there was none else to whom I could go and to obtain mercy. And the Lord heard my cry in the wilderness. And while in the attitude of calling upon the Lord in the 16th year of my age, a pillar of light above the brightness of the sun at noonday come down, I'm reading his language, not mine, come down from above and rested upon me. And I was filled with the Spirit of God. And the Lord opened the heavens upon me. And I saw the Lord, and he spake unto me, saying, Joseph, my son, thy sins are forgiven thee. Go thy way, walk in my statutes, and keep my commandments. Behold, I am the Lord of glory. I was crucified for the world, that all who believe on my name may have eternal life. Then he goes on a little further beyond that. That is his earliest written recollection of what happened when he was approximately 16 years old. And so what was the purpose of this experience and of going into the wilderness, right? So this was not about creating a church. In this early account, he just was not going out because he was troubled about churches. He was troubled about himself, right? And troubled about what he was seeing in the lives of people around him. And so it wasn't about creating a church. His concern was about his own relationship with God, is the language we would use. And notice that in this vision, it's one person who appears to him. It is Christ who appears to him and says, I am the Lord of glory. I was crucified. And then says, go thy way. The sins are forgiven. And basically says, all right, and be careful about messing up from this point on. I'm paraphrasing. keep my commandments, essentially. And that was the experience. And it filled Joseph with a sense of love and a sense of forgiveness. One of the things I love about this early version is that right after this, he says in the account, but basically not long after that, I started messing up again. So
That's
in other words,
pretty honest
it's
approach for any of us.
And of course, he's 16, right? So
Right.
so that's the earliest account we have of the first vision. Sadly, the 1842 account, which everybody seems to know in the church, the one that used to be in the old tract, Joseph Smith tells his own story, that one overshadowed the earliest one. The earliest one was not actually published ever until Dick Howard published it in 1981. And so, what can we notice about this vision in light of the context, Joseph's own religious setting? So, this is a period in American history called the Revivalist period. Also, it's sometimes referred to as the Second Great Awakening, a period of intense religious revival running from 1790 to about 1840. And there were revivalist preachers traveling all over the frontier, and a number of them recounted similar original conversion or call experiences that sound remarkably like Joseph. So there was Lorenzo Dow, who was a self-identified Methodist. The Methodists weren't sure that they wanted him, but he identified as a Methodist. Lorenzo Dow. And there was a Presbyterian named Charles Grandison Finney. And there was a Universalist preacher named Caleb Rich, and others. And these recount experiences of going into the woods, the wilderness, and having some kind of conversion moment that ultimately led to a sense of their call to be a revivalist or a preacher. And so these features appear again and again in these accounts. So that's at the start of the movement, when we don't even know that there's a movement yet, right? And so why was this significant initially? Well, as I mentioned, the earliest account wasn't published, and up until around 1842, a lot of members of the church never really knew about Joseph's experience in the grove. It wasn't a main thing, but it was important to Joseph enough that he hand wrote it in this letter book. And I think it's also important to note that initially, this is an experience that highlights God's love and forgiveness, Christ's presence with him in the experience. It's Christ who speaks. Christ is personal. Christ cares about him, and is deigning to meet a young person, right, in a time of spiritual crisis, and not just an older person. So you have to remember too that we do know from other sources that Joseph Smith Jr. wasn't taken very seriously about this. So there's a sense in which this experience was quite remarkable and moving for him, because he was being taken seriously by Christ. And so that's that earliest experience. And it really deserves more play in the church over against the 1842 account, which develops much later. And the 1842 account is much more an attempt to justify his role as a prophet and justify the existence of this church, which is now separate from other churches. But the 1831-32 account is quite different. It's a conversion story.
So taking a look at the first version of the first vision is really important. Another theme or another item that we think is really important in this first time period is the idea that God still speaks, or we've called it different things. Continuing revelation is something we've often called it as well. So from Joseph's first experience, that experience in the grove, through the writing of the Book of Mormon and prophetic statements that eventually would become part of the Doctrine and Covenants, this concept that God is still speaking, that we can hear and discern and share that with others, became a hallmark of the early movement. And the idea that God still speaks fits really well in Joseph's cultural setting, his context, with its democratized Christian experiments, where there's a reclaiming of this idea that Christians have immediate access to God. We don't need the scholars. We don't need the clerics. We don't need the liturgy. We can have connection with God ourselves, and we can hear God ourselves. And this was pretty common in this time period, especially with new groups that are growing, new religious expressions of that time. So, and then the idea not only that God can speak through some people in these new settings, these new groups that are forming, but that individually, that we have access to knowing and hearing God. And that access to God then can, and this is happening all over in Joseph's context, 18, well, 1810, 2030s, is kind of stripping away of conventional Christianity so that we can get to the real God and the real faith ourselves. And there were a number of groups, and ours would be considered one of them, that were called restoration groups, and or primitivist groups who are trying to get back to the original New Testament church. If we can just get back there, if we can discern it, if we can identify it within the New Testament, then we'll have the real thing, the best thing. And that's happening in where Joseph and the early church, but it's happening in the culture around as well. So it's a key structure in that primitivist worldview that we have restored original Christianity, and Revelation, God's continuing speaking to us, as in the New Testament, is a sign that we have that.
Next theme is the Book of Mormon. And the picture in front of you is a picture of an 1830 actual copy of the Book of Mormon. And so the writing and publication of the Book of Mormon, which was seen now as New World Scripture, that's deeply, deeply intertwined with the start of our movement. And it was the key mission tool. Those who read it and were moved by it, or those convinced that Joseph Smith Jr. was a prophet because of it, this book became extremely important in the growth of the church in that early period. What one thought about the book and what one thought about Joseph were almost inseparable in this time. What about context here once again? So again, if one reads the Book of Mormon carefully in light of early 1800s American religion, you can find a lot of connecting points with early 1800s American Protestant religion. But the power and the value of the book for its first readers was that it answered for them pressing religious questions. For example, questions about, are we free to choose God or are we predestined? That was a live question in this time. What about the form of baptism? What happened to the 10 tribes of Israel? And how do we account for these developed First Nations people who live on the land that we have taken? Might as well be honest about that. How do we account for them and their advanced civilizations and their burial mounds and all of that, right? And what about faith and works? How do we balance those out? And what about the relationship between Christ as Son and God as Father? How do we see that? What about the relationship between such things as justification and sanctification? And so all of these religious conundrums of the day, some people found significant, straightforward answers for in the Book of Mormon. In fact, one important theologian of the period, Alexander Campbell, from whom the Campbellites come, read the book and he said, gracious, every controversy we've ever talked about on the American frontier is right there in the book. So in any case, that was one of the reasons the book spoke so immediately to so many people in that early 1830s period. Go ahead, Charmaine. There's more about the other parts of the context there.
Yeah, and some other parts of context is that there's a growing awareness about the ancient world. During this time period, there's a real fascination with Egypt and artifacts from there. And so there's a growing awareness that there's other writings, ancient writings, that are accessible. It was assumed, and because people's primary connection to Christianity was the Bible, the Old and New Testament, it was kind of assumed that God speaking to us in a sustained way would come in a book as well. And so we get kind of a sense of the Book of Mormon fitting that bill. And then since the Book of Mormon was seen as an ancient writing that talked about God, it was almost immediately equated with Scripture. And, this is a place and a time where most people didn't have access to understanding how the New Testament came together or the Old Testament came together, how many hundreds of years it took for those writings to eventually have the status of canon or be authoritative. And there's just this equating of ancient writings about God must therefore be scripture. So there really wasn't questioned what this was. Another part of the context here is about what happens when a people are marginalized. And so the Book of Mormon was something that many people from other denominations used as a weapon to question Joseph or to question what it was about and where it came from. And so the defending of that became a really important part in the early church of our identity. We were a church with a new book, a new scripture, and we could prove that it was historical, and all of those kinds of things became very, very important in the beginning.
So the fourth theme or topic we're picking up on is what we call the community impulse towards Zion, the peaceable kingdom. And those things belong very much together in the early movement. And so in this one, what we're talking about is that the church's journey through this early period is distinguished by a strong sense of community, of life together. In fact, it's hard not to think of this early period without referencing cities or gatherings, right? Kirtland, Independence, Far West, Nauvoo. We don't think about isolated individual members living out on the prairie somewhere. We think about these gatherings of people. And so church was not, in this early period, a collection of isolated, saved individuals, but of a belonging together in mutual dependence. And so what can we tell about the context here? Well, this is something historians have really been able to unearth quite well for us, and that is that this was the era in American religious history of what are called communitarian experiments, like the Shakers, like the Oneida community in New York State, a group called the Vermont Pilgrims. I'll come back to them a little later. This sense that somehow to live a truly and fully Christian life, we had to do this as a community. Some of that was inspired by looking back at the book of Acts, and some of it was inspired by economics. It was reality. It was the reality for poor folks who had little capital. How do we survive here, right? And so pooling all of that together was the way that they could do that. And so so it's really important to remember that communitarianism did have connections to economic life. It wasn't just a theological thing. But being a community allowed a kind of shared prosperity, and that was really revealed in the Shaker movement. The Shakers became quite prosperous, which actually led eventually to the dissolution of the Shaker movement. So this became relevant, especially as the church community was expelled from one area to another. So the sense of belonging together, that the church is not a congregation or a couple of individuals, but a group. That was a key marker of this early era.
Another marker or theme is, we're calling it differentiated ministry and lay ordination. So the clergy of historic Christian traditions, like Anglicans, Congregationalists, Presbyterians, Lutherans, were often viewed with contempt by some of these revivalists. They critique them as a kind of caste, of people who are educated and therefore see themselves as being above the rest of us. And they also sometimes be suspicious of worship forms that were set in stone, they might say. The kind of theological clerical training that a Congregationalist minister might have got at Harvard or Yale was really out of reach for most of the revivalist ministers and churchgoers in the West. And so that democratizing impulse in American religion helped kind of dismiss the necessity of having theological training or seeing it as being elitist.
And so it's kind of interesting that Joseph Smith's words in Doctrine and Covenants 4 from 1829, I mean, before the church was even officially organized, that faith, hope, charity, and love with an eye single to the glory of God qualifies one for the work. That's, in a sense, quite remarkable in this period, but not. On the American frontier, where the revivalists were, these guys, and by the way, there were a few women revivalists back then, but most of them were men. They did not have formal theological training, and they actually sneered at it, which is unfortunate, but you can understand. But for Joseph to say something like this really fits the context quite well. And so this ethos had an equalizing effect in the church. It also tapped into the New Testament image of fishermen and former prostitutes and tax collectors and so on, becoming the proclaimers of the good news, right? And so it was not the trained rabbis, except perhaps in the case of Paul, but not the trained rabbis, but it was the everyday people in Galilee who were the first disciples and the ones who helped go out and preach this message after Easter. And so this was really important in the early church. And it's also important to note, this is an irony in it. In spite of this critique that our early church shared about formalized training, as soon as they got to Kirtland, one of the things Joseph tried to organize was basically a theological seminary. We got to get our people trained. And they had some rudimentary classes in Hebrew and Greek, which makes my heart feel warm, like a kind of a Methodist warming of my heart, actually. So.
All right. And another of these themes is a new Pentecost, the gifts of the Holy Spirit. Again, in light of that egalitarian impulse on the American frontier, you did not have to be educated or of high social standing or to be old or mature in order to experience the Spirit and to bring spiritual gifts to the community, just as in Acts in the New Testament. And so this was seen again as an affirmation that the church was being reborn in its earliest pristine kind of setting. So, of course, people didn't know that within the New Testament, there are different kinds of communities that are being shaped, different ways the Spirit is working. But this was another way that we could say God is at work in this time and in this moment. And there sometimes was also this sense that because the Spirit was suddenly on display, able to do these things through these people, it was also a sign of the latter days, the completion of and the return of God's will as far as the gifts of the Spirit.
And so inside the church, the presence of these gifts were treated as a validation, right? They were treated as a validation to earliest members that this was the church as it was supposed to be, the one they read about in the New Testament. And so that was quite an important shaper of their convictions.
So the gifts were connected to the belief in community too. The idea that we need all the gifts. We need the Spirit working in different people for the sake of the whole body. So it wasn't just about gifts that one person had that drew attention to them, but it was about how is the Spirit working for the good of the whole body in these different gifts that are being given life in individuals' lives.
Again, this does fit parts of the religious context of that period. So, the frontier revivals, they were the greatest show on earth when they came to town, and they were often places or events in which people had ecstatic experiences, right? Often a kind of swooning when they heard the revivalists preach about sin and their own sense of guilt. And some of these revivalist preachers recount in their diaries that they had a dream or a vision. And so these were not unheard of in the revivals. Also, that movement I mentioned a little bit earlier, the Vermont Pilgrims and their leader, Isaac Bullard. Isaac Bullard was imagined to be a prophet, and he was treated as somebody who spoke directly for God. The Vermont Pilgrims are an interesting group to study. They lived communally. They didn't wash. They wore bearskins even in the summer. I'm sure you could tell when they were coming to town from quite a distance, I imagine. And they ended up going down the Ohio River, and they disappeared into Arkansas territory. Were never heard from again, really. So prophets were around, and people were experiencing ecstatic gifts. Right? So the last one we're going to look at tonight is what we'll call dissent. This is everybody's favorite one, I think, in our movement. We sometimes say that our movement, we were born with a dissenting gene. And as we move through other segments of these CIMM sessions, you'll understand a little bit more why. But right in front of you is a facsimile picture of a one-issue newspaper called the Nauvoo Expositor that was published by former church members right in downtown Nauvoo on June 7th, 1844. William Law was the head of this small group of dissenters. William Law had been a member of the presidency. Pretty much all of them had been expelled from the church. But
for questioning
Mhm.
Joseph and some of his teachings and actions.
Right. So the expositor tried to expose everything that was going on, and it didn't sit well with a lot of people. In fact, Joseph had the city council order declared a nuisance. They called in the law enforcement with the Nauvoo Legion behind them. They destroyed the press and destroyed its type in the city streets. And it's a shame because the Nauvoo Expositor was a powerful theological document. But you can see here that dissent was not tolerated, certainly in Nauvoo. But dissent went on into the reorganization. So June 7th, 1844, Nauvoo Expositor says no to all kinds of stuff Joseph was doing. The reorganization later, in the spirit of the expositor, says no to theocracy, to polygamy, to all kinds of religious authoritarianism, and to polytheism. Eventually the reorganization says no to polytheism. And then in Community of Christ, we practice today what we call faithful disagreement, that we have the freedom to say no in a respectful way, right? And so this is important. In other words, in that democratized environment, many members did not take kindly to being told they must do X and they could not do Y. And so that led to the Nauvoo Expositor, about which you'll hear a little bit more in the session we do next time.
So what we've been trying to do is give just a little snapshot of those first 20-ish years and looking at some of the elements that were really important that defined the movement, and to kind of get a sense of how they developed in that context, in that historical time and context. And now we're just going to go back through them fairly quickly and identify what are the implications for today of these particular themes or ideas. And so are they beneficial? Are they problematic? And sometimes they're both. And so we'll take a look and see what are the implications of these for today. So Joseph's first vision, its earliest form. In the last few decades, that version of Joseph's experience has really spoken louder than the 1842 account that was more public, and that probably for many church members our age and older was the only one that we knew, where it was against other churches and it was about Joseph creating a new church. But the one that talks about his conversion experience, encounter with God, knowing that he was loved and forgiven, that's really taken on a life of its own in the church in the last few decades, partly because it's really focused on God being present with us in our personal struggles, and because it doesn't rely on the idea that our personal relationship with God has to be presupposed by everybody else's wrongness, which is the 1842 version. There had to be absolute wrong and absolute right. Also that encounter with God, that God is wanting to encounter us all, that it's for everyone, that God is present and aware of our struggles, and the idea of intimacy with God as being a good thing and being essential for many people. So there's also an appeal in the fact that after the divine encounter, Joseph continued to mess up. I mean, that's one of the things I love about the Old Testament. They didn't try to hide the fact that human beings are human, and we need God continuously in our lives. So those are some of the ways in which Joseph's vision has an impact today. The second one, God still speaks. That's still essential to our identity and how we work together as a body. Today we see that perhaps more in discernment, the concept of discernment, in their expectation that God is present and seeks us and yearns to be known. We hear that language in our spiritual practices and in our life in the world, and that God is concerned about our world, our lives, and our relationship with God and each other. And then continuing revelation allows, I think Tony used this phrase earlier, course changes.
I got it from you.
Oh, did you? All right, good.
Footnote you on that.
Okay. Things like ordination of women, that was a big adjustment. Greater recognition and inclusion of LGBTQIA people in the church, an opening of the church to being expressed in a variety of different cultures and languages that are not North American. So the idea that God is still speaking is still really crucial to our identity.
So then we'll go on to the Book of Mormon. And this one is in essence a mixed bag in the church today. There are some storylines of the Book of Mormon that have inspired some of the peace and justice hopes of the church. And also there are still plenty of members who have had significant life-changing experiences with the Book of Mormon. On the other hand, the Book of Mormon is very, very American, which people who grew up in North America can't see. But if you take it outside the United States, it's very easy for people to see. And it hasn't translated well into other cultures. And I don't mean by language, but I mean culturally hasn't translated. So there's a note in Don Landon's oral history. He was a missionary in Scandinavia in the mid-1950s, and kind of wondered why church members didn't really use the Book of Mormon in Denmark. And they said, we don't, because if we try to, we're immediately confused with Mormons, and we don't want to be. And then he discovered a bunch of Book of Mormons that had been printed in Danish in the early 1900s, and they were still in their bindery wrappings some 50 plus years later. Because church members said, it just doesn't fit our setting here. So that's an example of one of the problems. Another difficulty with the Book of Mormon is what we would now call, it has a doctrine of white supremacy in it. In the storyline, somehow whiteness is preferable to darkness. And that's really, really problematic. Not only in other parts of the world, but it's problematic here too. So the source question, where do these things come from in the Book of Mormon, is still very much a live question.
And one of the issues with the Book of Mormon initially and still today has to do more with its origins than with its message. We often get sidetracked by who wrote it, who didn't, when was it, is it real history, is it something else? So that still tends to be what rises to the surface rather than what is the message that is consistent with the biblical message of Jesus and God.
Okay, I'll go on to the next one.
I think maybe one more piece about the Book of Mormon is that it's not really the identity piece that it used to be. So starting at least by the 1960s, the Book of Mormon as part of the primary ideas of our identity begins to fade. And so partly because it doesn't translate well into all the different places where the church is being called.
And that's not just us. By the time the church got to Nauvoo, the Book of Mormon was not central to Joseph's own theology too. So that's important to know. So then we'll go on to the community impulse towards Zion and the peaceable kingdom. And, being together remains deeply important in this tradition, which if you're like us, we're often some of the last people to leave church because we're standing around wanting to talk to people for a long time. Being together is so much a part of our ethos. And we have reunions, we have camps, we have retreats, we have conferences, congregation gatherings, small gatherings, and so on. That's an important legacy from the early period. Being together has become, in some ways, a little more complicated and difficult. For example, COVID made being together in the way we were used to very difficult. And there's also the closing of congregations and campgrounds and what that sometimes means for being together. There's the difficulties older members have in trying to get to church or church gatherings. And then we have, certainly in the United States, there's increasingly a culture of isolation and extreme individualism that makes being together psychologically, emotionally complicated for people. But even before COVID, online communities and congregations were beginning to form. And during COVID, the opportunity to worship online meant that some people could attend two congregations on the same day. And in other words, they had another way to be together because we need that so much in our discipleship. Right. And so even those not attending a congregation regularly know they are welcome and belong. This happens at reunion sometimes when someone who never goes to church shows up for a day at reunion because they know where reunion is and they know the people who will be there, and that means something to them. Now, along with this, the peace theme has increasingly come into its own in our church. How to live that vision is going to be really complicated, certainly in the United States, in these politically very polarized times. And it's also in other countries too are experiencing that. That's going to be really complex for us. It's going to continue to challenge the church as we try to live Christ's peaceable kingdom and figure out how to be together when we could be so utterly different politically.
So then what are the implications of differentiated ministry or lay ordination? And actually, this is fascinating because there are a number of mainstream denominations that are investing in training and ordaining and setting apart set lay people in ministry roles. So we see that there's a spreading of that idea and an embracing of it. There, some of the pieces that we've taken a little deeper in our movement is added requirement of some basic training for ordination. And that's actually really empowered a lot of people to be confident in their ministry, to be confident in their discussions with other ministers, to be involved in ecumenical ministries and support in their communities. And it also, one of the other things is that in a very diverse church, the roles of a priest in one place and another place are going to be very similar. There's going to be some continuity that part of our identity gives us. And the model of regular everyday people who aren't getting paid but are providing ministry in the congregation also helps us to affirm and recognize the ministry of all people. And at least it can. And I think that it is doing that. It's like there's all different kinds of ministry roles through ordination, but it helps us to understand and see the ministry that's being brought in so many other ways as well. The ministry of all believers, in effect. And then gifts of the Spirit. Today, discernment, as mentioned earlier, is something the church highly values, not only on a personal level, but as a whole body and as groups, and spiritual gifts are something that has been taking deeper root as ways of tapping into the Spirit that's moving all around us, that is at work in all of creation. So these are some additional ways in which we have valued and lifted up the importance and presence of the Holy Spirit.
And finally, the dissent theme. Well, as I said, we're a church with a tradition and a genetic code that has dissent marked in it somewhere. But the idea of faithful disagreement, it has the potential to become a creative and positive way to make space for proper disagreement or dissent within the church. And that would be a legacy that depends all the way back to 1844. So just a quick run through of some themes in the early period and what their relevance for today is. And before we entertain some questions, we're going to move over and be with David here in just a minute. We can tell you that for our second session next time, sifting and sorting the pre-reorganization period, kind of that period from roughly 1846 up to 1860. What the heck was going on then, right?
It was a very uncomfortable time for a lot of people.
It was. That's a picture of the Plano, Illinois church, by the way, there. And so we'll deal with some of the theological themes and developments that take place in that period, especially around the figure of Jason Briggs and Zenas Gurley Sr. David?
All right. Well, come on over here, folks. We're going to change our location. And wow. Okay. So yeah, you condensed that.
Things that could have been talked about, and we had to pick 7. That just seemed like a good number.
7 is always good, isn't it? So I'm thinking about the early church and how we used to place it in a bubble of being not influenced by anything but being its own thing, and yet we recognize that Joseph Smith went to the revivals of a number of different groups, that his parents were 2 different faith movements. And in fact, that brought some discord in the family. And we were highly impacted by, as you mentioned, the Restoration movement of the Campbellites and the Disciples of Christ. And so with all of those things, we recognize, actually, when we go back to that first vision account, that we're dealing with something we all go through and are influenced by all those things that come out of it. Can you talk a little bit more about who were the big influencers on us at that time, and where are those echoes still coming back into our movement today?
Well, so a big influencer in this time is a theological dispute that goes back to the 1600s in the Netherlands. By the
Netherlands.
way, yeah,
Didn't
you might have heard the name of James or Jacob Arminius, and Arminius was a Dutch Calvinist preacher who decided that typical Dutch Calvinist predestination left something to be desired. Right, this preaching that the idea that the elect are chosen before all time to be saved, and the reprobate are chosen before all time to be damned. Arminius wanted to make some kind of space for human freedom and choice and activity in that, and his ideas influenced later John Wesley. And if you don't have Arminianism, you really don't have revivals, because you know, pretty much if the elect are the predestined or the saved, you don't need to preach out in an open field saying you better choose Jesus tonight,
Because God's already decided that.
right? And so that it was a Catholic sociologist named Thomas O'Day who wrote a classic book on Mormonism back in the 1950s called The Mormons. He, I think, more clearly than anybody I've ever read, has said, when you read the Book of Mormon, you see Arminianism everywhere, and it's a kind of a defense of an Arminianist Wesleyan sort of, you get to choose you have a right and a freedom to choose if you'll follow Jesus, which we sort of take for granted in the church, but that's not always been the case in Christianity. Yeah. So that's an influencer coming through the Methodists. The Puritan theology influenced things. You find certainly one really important Puritan theme you find in the Book of Mormon is the idea of God's condescension. The Book of Mormon uses the term exactly like the Puritans did, and refers to God accommodating God's self to human weakness and so on, so we can understand. And the Puritans use the term condescension to describe that.
Again, these are theological questions being asked during this time.
Yeah.
And some have even theorized that Joseph was trying to make peace in his family by picking out these pieces that everybody could enjoy. But
Everybody wins.
yeah, everybody. We've got a number of questions here today. Does Community of Christ have a unique perspective contrasted with other Christian churches, which I think we were talking about, regarding working out our salvation, not just individually, but also communally?
I wouldn't say it's unique. I mean, our story is unique. Our journey is unique, and we've embraced some parts of our story that make us particularly able to serve God in certain ways. But that idea was present. It's present in other groups as well. Some of those communitarian groups where it's how you live together, and it's how you choose to to live a Christian life together is what is a kind of salvation.
Yeah.
Which we still see through some groups
Mhm.
today,
Mhm.
especially those like the Amish who live apart
Yeah.
in community.
Yeah, this reminds me of a story I read once about, some fundamentalist guy went up to an Amish guy and said, are you saved? And the Amish guy said, well, let me go ask the people around me and see what they say about that. In other words, the
Right.
idea of his salvation being an individual thing he had somehow created by
Yeah.
saying the right words.
Yeah.
It didn't fit because of the communal nature of Amish life.
Yeah.
And later in these sessions, when we get to Fred M. Smith, we'll talk about the social gospel movement and Walter Rauschenbusch's idea of social salvation, and that Fred M. Smith picks up on that, and it fit because we already kind of had a sense of that. So,
Mhm.
so
And so again, not being in the bubble, that as we look to the story of the church, we begin to see less and less prophet and a side story, the people, and are starting more to see the people who happen to have this prophet, once different prophets during different times, and 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 that even in Joseph's time, in his lifetime, interpreted his hallmark starting experience differently. And it had to do with what was going on at that time. When he's talking earlier about his experience, it's a salvation experience, not uncommon to other people who were having it at the time. When he's talking about in Nauvoo, he is just got escaped from jail, been tarred and feathered, had people run them out of their states, and was looking to bring some kind of cohesiveness and safety into the lives of both his family as well as the people, which take on totally different formats. And I think as we see how our church has progressed during these different eras, we also recognize that we're changing now. And that part of this revelatory experience is not just God, but it's us changing.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
yeah, certainly in our perceptions and the ability to understand our own past and so on, we have different tools and different experiences today. So
How we tell our story, it changes, it changes, it changes.
How we tell a story. And that's a good point also. There were other people telling the story differently through the time. And yeah,
Yeah, and what are the questions that we're asking that maybe we haven't asked before?
and so I'm not sure how this relates necessarily to today's, but how much space is there for non-Trinitarian in Community of Christ?
Well, we've already said we are a church that has this dissenting gene, but it's more than that. There's the sense, and we'll talk about it more with Joseph Smith III, but the idea of a big umbrella that we don't have a statement that you have to sign on to in order to be a member. There's not only one theology. There is the public theology of the church, and that's kind of what we work with most of the time. But there's also individual theologies of people, of individuals, and there's not it's not required that people have a particular view about the Trinity in order to be a member or a priesthood member, or that's not required. But it is very much a part of our understanding of who God is, how God works in the world, why we respond to Christ for the sake of others and ourselves. So it's it's one of those places where there's lots of room for discussion, and there's no force involved.
Well, and I think alongside of that, there are many different views in our faith movement over the Book of Mormon.
Absolutely.
And our look at church history. And I mean, we talked about the gifts of the Spirit, how we've reinterpreted that to not be so much demonstrative as much as self awareness and calling in how we express those in the congregation. So when we talk about giftedness now, we're not usually talking about being slain in the spirit as much as we're talking about, I feel called to preach, or I feel called to move out into the neighborhood to this group.
Music ministry.
Right.
Work with children or.
And so
Children
we even look at that point differently.
Yeah.
Wow, too much to talk about today. We're already at our time limit, but we will be back next week to talk about the second session and get into the reorganization and the Briggs and Gurley experience in the barn and in Beloit and all the wonderful things that change. Especially, I'm interested in the that gap period between 1844 and 1860 as we begin to redevelop as to who we are. But for those of you who have joined us tonight, we welcome you to come back to part 2 of this as we continue the discussion.